why that laser pointer's not working too well. There you go. So Dan to Beersheba, Mount Hermon being the highest point, of course Dead Sea down here being the lowest point. And that's just a more zoomed out look at that map. This is a little bit more zoomed in on the Dead Sea area. But I just wanted to mention that because I mentioned those maps. I'm not going to go back and reteach all that material, but just to give you an idea of that. If we could, let's do lesson 1. And I'm going to go real quick over just something there. And then we'll go into lesson 2, which is for tonight. I appreciate that, Hamilton. I didn't mean for it to be so much work for the people running the AV. I meant to get this all into one PowerPoint. We talked about, I'm just going to have to click through this quickly, and I apologize if you weren't here last week. It's on the live stream, but I don't want to take all my time just reteaching what we did last week. We talked about the geology of the area. We talked about the elevation of the area from again, Mount Hermon being the highest, Dead Sea being the lowest. Dead Sea, incidentally, is the lowest point on Earth, that area, not just in the region, but on Earth. We talked about the climate, some areas getting a lot of rain, some areas getting very little, some areas being very cold, some areas being very hot. We talked about vegetation. This is what I wanted to mention because I didn't have this verse last week. I missed this. And Deuteronomy 8:8. Let's go look at that. Again, I'm not going to redo all of what we talked about with vegetation, but we mentioned these 7 species. The rabbis would often refer to them as the 7 species: wheat, barley, grape, fig, pomegranate, date, and olive. But you actually catch all 7 of them in Deuteronomy 8:8. Let's actually do 8, 7, and 8. Who's got that? Okay, Bob. All right, so help me get them all, Bob. Wheat, barley, vine, that'd be the grape. What was next? Fig tree, pomegranate, olive, and that's olive oil, and the honey would be a reference to the date. So there are your 7 species that we talked about. So it actually mentions those in Scripture. The term 7 species is an uninspired term you brought about later on, but you do see those 7 mainstays mentioned there. I wanted to mention, Adam pointed out to me that I said something about this caracal. I wasn't sure how to pronounce it. I went and learned how to pronounce it between last week and this week. The caracal, and I said something about, I said something about the caracal, and then I said, I didn't have my picture here. And Adam said, so now we know you're the caracal. Just shows you got to be careful how you say something, right? But anyways, there, I thought that picture would be bigger than it is. I hope you can see that. But you see these 2 pictures, that's that little creature there. Some people call them I was trying to remember, some folks refer to it as either a puma or a lynx, but those are actually technically a different species, but very similar. They're very recognizable by those tufts on the ears. Look like they've got horns because of that. But that's one of the more interesting predatory animals. By the way, we'll mention this a little bit later on, but lions are referred to quite often in Scripture. But if you go over to the land of Palestine today, you couldn't find a lion for anything. Why is that? Some folks have asked that, and they say, well, did the Bible just, some people have actually very ignorantly accused the Bible of just making up, there are no lions in the Palestinian region, so somebody just made that up when they wrote. Why are there no lions? The Romans. Pretty much the Romans, what were left by the time of the Roman Empire got wiped out. Gladiatorial contests, putting them on for a show, kind of a moving zoo. Gladiatorial contests would often be with these parade of animals. Sometimes you'd have a gladiator fighting an animal and things like that, but they hunted them down for stuff like that. And so just like, sometimes today an animal may go extinct from just being hunted too much. In that region, they're gone. and that's why. Okay, now we're ready for lesson number 2. I wanted to mention that because I said I was going to try to get you a picture of the caracal. And for some reason, my iPad is not wanting to respond. I like to have my lessons pulled up, but for some reason, let me try again here. Lesson 2, okay. I did want to mention this. This is kind of if you wonder, I told you I'm going to approach this sort of similar to how it would be if you walk through the, I was talking to Josh Clevenger, he preaches at Rockmart, we were talking about this today, and I've never taught a Bible geography class, and that was kind of what I was, when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, I'm not sure how I would approach that. Do you want to go, just talk about the mountains of the Bible and then talk about the bodies of water, or how do you want to approach that? And so I remembered how they do it down there, and I thought, you know what, that's kind of a neat approach. You look at the life of a shepherd, you look at the life of a farmer, look at the life in a village or a community. But this last time, Cliff and I and Dave and Nikki and Cliff's family, we went down there and we spent a little bit more time looking around the gift shop than I have other times that I've been, and they have this book, again, The Life of the Shepherd, Farmer, and Village in Biblical Times by James Fleming. You can get this, I mentioned it, I thought it would probably be available somewhere else, and it is, biblicalresources.net, $39 if you want to get one. Of course, I've got it from the gift shop down there, and I'd already been looking through it before I'd even determined I was going to teach this class, and I'm really, really impressed with it, because if you've ever been on the tour down there, especially a guided one, going through the book feels like very similar to how they take you through. There's a few extra things that we'll throw in, but very similar to that. Now, Amazon.com also has them. You can get one used. This is used for $26.94 with free shipping. I found another one, $22.99, $3.96 shipping, and if you're just out of your mind, you could pay used $74.28. I don't know, it's listed there, but I thought you'd have to be crazy when you could go buy one brand new for $39, but that's Amazon. Sometimes you can find books on there that are used and they're 3 times what you would pay new. But anyways, I just wanted to share that with you. All right, let's talk about water. Obviously, water is the very basis of life. You cannot have life without water. So when you're talking about the life of a shepherd, nomadic life, it's always going to center around water, especially when you're dealing with desert areas. Water is very scarce in desert regions. So you essentially have 2 choices, springs or wells. Springs, when we say springs, we're including rivers, streams, things like that, because they're going to stem from somewhere, which would be a spring. So you got springs, you got wells. Springs in the desert, obviously they're invaluable, because you don't just have water all over the place in the desert. And so what do you reckon happens a lot of times near a spring? That's probably where people are going to settle, right? But not everybody can settle right near one spring. And so we'll get into wells, and we'll talk about that later. So springs are invaluable. Here's a verse. I don't know if everybody can see that, but we just read it in Deuteronomy 8, verse 7, "For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills." So he's talking about spring-type water, whether you're talking rivers, creeks, but it's provided by the Lord. And there's a contrast quite often, and you'll see this in scriptures. We talk about water, a contrast between wells, which are the result of human effort, versus springs, rivers, creeks, that kind of thing, which are the result of zero human effort. You don't have to do anything for those. They just come right. It's coming out of the ground. It's flowing down. Whether you're talking about the Nile, the Jordan, there it is. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to work for it. So there's a stark contrast there. The springs would become referred to as living water. for a number of reasons. For one thing, it's moving compared to water that's just sitting in a cistern or a well. It's moving, so it's kind of considered living. It's water that'll keep you living. It's fresh. It won't get stagnant. If you're there at a spring, it never gets stagnant, right? Because it's moving. It's living water. So they would refer to spring water, moving water, free-flowing water as living water. Here you see in the pictures, I didn't mention that on the other slide. Down here at the bottom left, these are some bulrushes. You remember Moses' mother hid him in the bulrushes? Anybody know what this is up here? Anybody recognize that? We probably looked at this when we talked about our How We Got the Bible study. Some of these plants, we would have looked at them in a much more refined state, non-living state. Somebody said it. Several people said it. Papyrus, yes. Those are papyrus plants. Later on, that's one of the first types of paper. So later on, they would take these plants, split them open, you lay them out, and there's a process. But it makes paper. So it's a pretty brittle, not a very durable type of paper, but it was a very, very popular means of writing in the ancient world. Bottom right, you've just got this is actually a picture out of the book, and sometimes I'll use pictures out of the book. I actually called them today just to double check. I told them, I said, I've been down there 4 times. I thought I took a lot more pictures than I did. I said, it occurred to me I could just take my cell phone sometimes and take a picture out of the book and use that in the slideshow, but I felt better about getting permission. I kind of was nervous as I asked that question because, the old saying is it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. But I thought, I better check with them before I just take a picture out of the book and put that on the big screen. But they told me it was fine as long as I give credit. So that's actually the little spring water setup that they've got. It's a model that they've got set up there at the Biblical History Center to show you kind of an example of what a spring in Palestine might look like. Not necessarily made after anyone in particular, but just to give you an idea. Here's another passage. Let's go to Isaiah 41. I don't know if you can see that or not, but if not, let's turn to Isaiah 41. Some of these scriptures I'll put on the screen, not all of them, but some of these I did. Anybody want to volunteer to read Isaiah 41, 17 and 18? Okay.
Poor and needy seek water, but there is none. Their tongues fail for thirst. I, the Lord, will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers in desolate heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water.
All right. The poor, the needy, they're thirsty. By the way, in Scripture, you're going to see, especially in the Old Testament, especially in the Law of Moses, Israel's told, and it's reinforced in the New Testament, God is very concerned about the plight of the poor and the needy. And it's incumbent upon us as Christians to be concerned about it as well. And going with that would be the fatherless. It's one of the things that really compelled us as a family to look into and to begin participating in foster care. Because God is so concerned with the plight of the fatherless, the poor, the needy, the widow, and over again in Scripture, God is pictured as looking out for them, and He gives stern warning to His people: don't mess with them, because the Lord pleads their cause. So He says here, poor people, they're thirsty. And again, you have this contrast. They're thirsty, and instead of having to go dig a well or of a lot of effort He says, I'm going to take care of them. I'm going to open rivers in high places, fountains in the midst of the valleys. I'll make the wilderness just become a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. I'm bringing it to them. There's going to be living water. What is this really talking about, by the way? It's the gospel. It's ultimately looking toward that. And the latter part of Isaiah, you're getting into the messianic section. And so what God is saying is, I'm bringing water to the poor. Who's the poor? Well, Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. There are people who are poor in spirit. We're all poor in the sense of we're helpless. Just like a needy person, a poor person, a widow who has no one to take care of her, just like an orphan, just like a fatherless child. We're in need spiritually. And God says, I'm bringing the water to them. And that water came in the person of Jesus Christ. So a lot of messianic foreshadowing just in the concept of water in the Old Testament. Again, considering this idea of springs, you got Isaiah 49:10. They shall not hunger nor thirst, neither shall the heat nor sun smite them, for he that hath mercy on them shall lead them, even by the springs of water shall he guide them. So you have that idea of these springs of water. I don't know if I'm doing something to that, but that is driving me crazy. No, battery's about full. Jeremiah 2:13, I love this verse. God says, my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and they've hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. God says they had living water right there. You just dip your cup in and take a drink. You had living water. You turned your back on that, and you went and with all your human effort, and you're trying to do your own thing, and all you end up with is a cistern that won't even hold water. We would say you're putting your water, it's like trying to, you're sitting here by a spring, and instead of getting spring-fed water, you're over here digging a hole. I'm gonna get my water, and then you put it into a bucket full of holes, and you just start carrying it, and you get home, and you go, well, I got nothing here. What's going on? That's how foolish God's people were being. They had forsaken the fountain of living waters. Same concept in Jeremiah 17:13. O Lord, the hope of Israel, all that forsake thee shall be ashamed, and they that depart from me shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters. He said, you've turned away from the living water. What's left? Just stagnant poison water that's going to kill you. And that's what their idolatry and their disobedience and their rebellion did to them spiritually. Again, these are often referred to, these springs, free-flowing water, as living water, but it came to represent God's grace. You've probably seen some of this as we're going along. You've probably seen where we're going with this. It came among the Jews to represent God's grace. Again, because it's not the result of human effort. You're not earning this. It's not because you deserve it, and also because it comes to you. And so you have in John chapter 4, let's turn there, and maybe you've already thought of John chapter 4. What's happening in John chapter 4 when we get there as we're turning? Jesus, you see his humanity. He's passing through Samaria, and he's tired. And so he sits down to take a break. And he sits down at this well. And he sees this woman, and he asks her for a drink. Of course, verse 9 tells us that she says, how is it that you, being a Jew, the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get along, and the Jews were very racist toward the Samaritans. By and large, not all Jews were. But don't be fooled, the Samaritans were very racist toward the Jews as well. Sometimes we pick on the Jews in that regard. They were, by and large, very prejudiced toward those Samaritans, but the Samaritans, by and large, were very prejudiced toward the Jews as well. And so she says, how is it that you, being a Jew, are asking drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. So Jesus answers and says unto her what? Somebody get verse 10. Now, you may remember we've talked about this before when we studied the book of John. If you were in our Sunday morning class, there's a theme in the book of John. Jesus will mention something and he'll make a spiritual point, a spiritual application, and the people take it very literally, right? And so he's going to talk about living water, and she's going to say, yeah, I want some living water. He starts talking about not having to come to this well and draw, and that sounds pretty good, right? And so he says, if you knew who you were talking to, you would have asked, and he would have given you living water. Now, he says this at a well. So you can almost picture this woman looking around going, hello? What living water? This is a well. Because that would have been kind of the contrast in her mind. And so the woman says to him, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and you have asked him. You have given me living water. Now, you may remember we've talked about this before when we studied the book of John. If you were in our Sunday morning class, there's a theme in the book of John. Jesus will mention something and he'll make a spiritual point, a spiritual application, and the people take it very literally, right? And so he's going to talk about not having to come to this well and draw, and that sounds pretty good, right? So You didn't even bring a pot, a clay jar, pot, something to draw with. You don't have anything to draw with. The well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? What are you talking about, son? What are you talking about? There's no living water here. You don't have anything to draw with. She's thinking this Jewish man's lost his mind. And then, of course, she says, are you greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well and drank thereof himself and his children and his cattle? Jesus answers her and says, of course, whosoever drinks of this water shall thirst again. But what? Whoever drinks the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. And of course, her next, she's still thinking very literally. She says, yes, give me some of that. And then Jesus is going to turn it into a spiritual conversation. But you see the play on words Jesus is making there, living water. And she's saying, there is no living water. This is a well. Jesus is the living water. He's the grace of God come down from heaven. We didn't deserve it. We didn't work for it. So God says, hey, congratulations, based on all your efforts, I'm sending you the Messiah. Quite the opposite, right? When we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 5:8. So he's the living water. If there were an insufficient number of Jews to have a synagogue, then they considered beside some kind of the law. But after synagogue worship came to be, synagogue worship popped up where? And the return from captivity. It seems to have popped up within the captivity itself, actually, maybe in Babylon. So somewhere during that or shortly thereafter, they began the synagogues. But there, I couldn't find a source. This comes from the book that I referenced in the beginning. But they didn't mention a source. I'm assuming it's the Mishnah, which is kind of a commentary on the law. And sometimes those commentaries get bound as law. And sometimes that happens in the church as well, doesn't it? But anyway, they said you had to have so many Jewish men to start a synagogue. If you didn't have enough, but you still had some Jewish men there in the community, or as the case may be, Jewish women, then you go beside some kind of free-flowing body of water. Does this remind you of a passage in Scripture? In the book of Acts, chapter 16, Paul comes to Philippi. Let's turn over to Acts 16. He comes to Philippi, and what was Paul's custom when he walked into a city? Straight to the synagogue. But for whatever reason, there is either not one in Philippi, or at least not in this particular little region. And so he's in Philippi, verse 12 tells us of Acts 16. And look at verse 13. Somebody read, please, 13 through 15. Okay, so you get into a city, straight to the synagogue. If there's not a synagogue, he knows to find the Jewish folks, right? Those folks are. It's not that they were more important or anything, but these are people that are looking for the Messiah. So it makes a ready audience. So he goes. Here's where prayers want to be made, or where they often got together for prayer. He goes and he finds an audience, and he teaches Lydia, and she obeys the gospel. So, living water, spring water. If there are no springs nearby, you needed a well. This picture comes from the book, 100-foot deep well at Lachish, Judea. That's quite a well. That's especially you consider they don't have the machinery that we have today. But again, wells were the result of human effort. Wells were often contrasted with springs, human effort versus grace. Wells would enable access to the groundwater, the water table during the dry season. Again, if you're in a desert area, how critical is that? If you've not been able to settle near a spring, or if you're a nomadic type of people and you're moving around, you've got to have water. So even again, remember some of those regions of Palestine we talked about last week, just maybe a cloudburst or two a year. It's going to be very critical that you have access to water. Let me cut out Exodus 2:16. We'll get that in just a moment. Let me get a volunteer, Isaiah 12:3, and I'll get Genesis 24 if somebody will get Isaiah 12:3. On water from the wells of salvation. So that illustration is used of drawing water and representative of the wells of salvation. Genesis 24:17 through 20. The servant ran to meet her and said, "Let me drink, my lord." And she hasted and let down her pitcher upon her hand and gave him drink. And when she had done giving him drink, she said, "I will draw water for thy camels also until they have done drinking." And she hasted and emptied her pitcher into the trough and ran again unto the well to draw water and drew for all his camels. This is Abraham's servant, as you recall. He's going to find for Isaac. So, by the way, I couldn't find a very good picture, but if you go to the museum, they actually have some pieces. I think they're actual pieces from wells over in the Palestinian region, and you'll see where in this, sometimes it's limestone, sometimes it's some other type of stone, but even in stone, where ropes have been drawn so many times, there are actually rope marks in this stone. And you can see where they've just over hundreds and sometimes thousands of years have drawn water up and down with the rope. And it's actually worn into the rock. So it's pretty interesting to see. I just couldn't get a real good picture of it, so I don't have one to show you. But wells are, of course, very vital, so they're often disputed. I'm still in Genesis, so let's turn over to Genesis 21:25. Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had violently taken away. Well, reckon why they'd violently take it away? Because wells are critical, and they want that water. And so sometimes instead of getting along and trying to work out something where, hey, we can share, sometimes people would steal or fight over a well. If you go to Genesis 26, we won't read this entire passage, but what this is talking about is Isaac. He has to redig some wells. If you begin at verse 18, it says he digged again the wells of water which they had digged in the days of Abraham his father, because the Philistines had stopped them. Maybe they're throwing rocks in there, maybe they're just filling them up with dirt, it doesn't say. But they stopped them after the death of Abraham. He called their names by the names which his father had called them. So they digged in the valley, found a well of springing water. Then the herdmen of Gerar did strive with Isaac's herdmen. So they're saying the water's ours. They dig another well, verse 21. They strove for that also, called the name of it Sitnah. He removed from thence, digged another well, verse 22. And this one they did not fight over, called it Rehoboth, for he said, "Now the Lord hath made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land." So you see, wells are often disputed because they're so important. Because they're so important, also, they become gathering spots, right? It's kind of like the water cooler at work, right? People gather around and what's going on in your day? Did you hear about Moses over there? Did you hear about Jethro? He's got a new son-in-law. Just their gathering spots. People begin to talk because it's so important, and people are going there. They're going there regularly. So, you see where it kind of becomes an important spot for more reasons than just one or two. Here's an example. Wells, they would often have stone-cut watering troughs. typically large enough for several animals to drink at one time. This is where I wanted to go to Exodus chapter 2, if you want to look at that. Exodus 2:16. Somebody got that? All right, the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They come, his daughters are drawing water, and they fill the troughs to feed, to water the father's flock. So there'd be something, oh yeah, that's better. I'm looking at a smaller version on the back screen. But yeah, you can see this trough down here right by the well. And then over here, this is actually at the Biblical History Center. If I recall correctly, that's actually there. And so you can see this trough area. This, if I'm not mistaken, is the same well there at the Biblical History Center. But you could, your animals could come and you could get the water to stay there so you can water them. It's interesting because the first time I went there, it was just kind of as Mr. Vern would say, it came off the page for me. Because I've read this passage before in Exodus 2, and I thought, they're out in the desert in the middle of nowhere. Did they just leave a trough by the well, or what's now you understand a little bit better. And I'm thinking, well, if it's some kind of, probably wouldn't have been some kind of a metal thing. If it's something wooden, it's just going to be subject to the weather and it's going to break down. But stone would obviously make sense and it would last. So a lot of times they would have these, and several animals could drink at the same time. Here's an artist's rendition of the well at Sychar. This would be where Jesus sat down to talk to the Samaritan woman. This is a 90-foot deep well. Jars were often used to draw and to carry water. Again, Jeremiah 2:13, broken cisterns that can hold no water. By the way, cisterns is sometimes used, you may have thought that was plural for sisters. I heard the joke about the guys say, brethren and sisters. Listen to me, brethren and cisterns. That's my joke. Yeah, thank you. Sometimes it's used to refer to, something to carry water in, but sometimes it's used and maybe in your home. You might have they'd have dirt floors in their homes, but you might dig a hole, line it with stone or something like that, or maybe sometimes they would put a clay container of some kind, very large. Now you can put water in there. And it would be even, it'd be in the actual floor, which means it's in the earth. That keeps it cooler. So you could put water in there. You could store grape juice, things like that. And so that would be a cistern. Sometimes it's just some kind of a pit for storing water. Sometimes a well might be referred to as a cistern. And sometimes it could just be a large container. So sometimes that term gets used pretty flexibly. And then here you see sometimes the entrance to a well or a cistern was very low to the ground. So they would roll a stone upon it. You can see this stone right here. Roll a stone over, just set it on the top when you're done. That keeps animals from falling in and from doing other things into your well that you don't want them doing, obviously. It would also help prevent algae. Sun's not shining in there, so it's going to keep algae from growing. So a lot of times they would have that and have a stone over it. I'm going to hush at this point. I asked Brother Jimmy ahead of time, so I'm not. Don't y'all think I'm putting him on the spot too much. But Brother Jimmy is, I think all of us know, Jimmy's in the business of wells, and so I said, well, when we talk about wells, I want to know, will you kind of share with the class a little bit about wells and tell us something about that? I could get him to tell me, but it's better to hear it from the expert. They can tell you all about it. So, Brother Jimmy, I'm going to yield the floor to Brother Jimmy and let him tell us about that. Do you want this, or do you want to use the Lord's table? What you want to do? Okay.
Chad showed some excellent pictures of wells. How many of y'all have ever irregular sides, and you can see the water down in it? Well, that well was quite old, and that irregular sides was because of erosion from the surface. It would have normally been vertical sides, but due to the overburden they dug, they would determine how hard and how straight that Many of the wells that our grandparents would have dug would have had steps in them, and I've been down in some where you'd put foot on one side and work your way to the bottom. And some of these wells they dug in that part of the world, he talked about the varying geology last week, and that had everything to do with what type of well was dug. Some of these wells were hewn into limestone, which has been a very difficult, and some of them went over 100 feet, some of them as deep as 200 feet. Where you're talking about if it was a 30-inch diameter hole, that would have been about a ton per foot. Now think about all the tons of material that was taken out of that hole and the time it would have taken, especially if you was using a chisel or a hammer and a drill bit and busting that out. Now the soil would have been much simpler to do. You'd take a pick and they'd put it in a bucket and somebody would draw it out, and you'd want the most reliable person at the top drawing it out because you didn't want that bucket back on your head. And you know, when you dug a well, you'd get down, and when you got below the water table, they would stop digging. And if you could get out, you had a well, and if you didn't, you had a grave. So, you know, you just wanted somebody there to help you get out. But it's amazing how deep they went. But some parts of that country was so arid, the wells would have been quite deep. And in some parts, it would have been closer to the coast or in the deep valley, the wells could have been quite shallow, just like it is in our area. And some of that part of the world, too, has the igneous rocks like we have here in the Piedmont. Some of it would have had sedimentary, especially closer to the Mediterranean and to the coast of some of these deeper valleys would have had a softer rock. It's like some of the limestone, the same limestone they were digging in for some of these deep wells would have been the same limestone you'd see used in the construction of some of the structures, because it could be actually sawed. It was that soft a limestone. It wasn't extremely hard. But it made some pretty good water. And some of the issues that Chad talked about too, the varying, they didn't get 50 inches of rain like we do in very few parts of that world. And so we get 50 plus inches, so our wells usually stay pretty consistent, but theirs wasn't that way. So theirs would have varied quite a bit, especially the shallower wells. But you and I really can't conceive of what it was like. We can say, well, you know, I understand that. Well, we can't understand that, really, because we're used to using about 100 gallons of water per day. Now think if you had to draw a clay jar up and down that well 100 times a day just for you, and then you had 10 kids, you'd have been there all day. And maybe somebody wouldn't have got a bath, and it probably would have been you. And the clay jar would have probably got busted a time or two. So you can see that was not practical. So they would have used, you know, less than a gallon a piece probably. And I would have liked that because I wouldn't have to take so many baths. And that would have been okay. Except, you know, something to drink sometimes you'd have had to go get it yourself. But, you know, we think we can imagine that. But, you know, you go to the faucet now or get in the shower, and it just goes so, you know, we just don't even think about it. But every time they needed water, it was a lot of thought, a lot of effort, and to be the patriarch of your family. And you had your family, your wife, your children, and if, you know, if they're not water in the house, the wife, that's the one that always caused me with issues as wives, so I know how that works. But think about all your livestock, having to deal with maybe hundreds of sheep. I saw one well that was dug back in that era, and it had ledges every few feet, and you wonder, what are these ledges for? Well, there was one ledge right near the bottom, and a man would get down there with one of those clay jars, and he'd dip water, and he'd hand it up to the next ledge, and he'd hand it to the different people until they got it all the way to the top. And they had this huge, like Chad showed, a trough. It said it was really large, and they could water 50 or 100 sheep, and they were poured out. And just as fast as they could go, those were coming up, and that jar was going right back down. They had several of them. It was just a continuous chain. But it worked, and they got it done. But it's amazing how civilization has changed. We know we don't have many wells like that anymore, and I'm thankful for that. But still, it's amazing how much it's changed in 2,000 years. It's amazing how it's still the same. We're still dependent on the Lord's blessing of water. Okay, Chad.
Thank you, Brother Jimmy. I appreciate that. That's fascinating to think about. I never thought about the steps. I've wondered before, like, you know, when you dig straight down wells, how do you get, like you said, if you get out, you got a well. If you don't, you got a grave. I like that. Yeah, I would. I'd have a tough time. I might need some help. But you could also see why they were so contested. When I read in Genesis 26 with Isaac, and 3 different times, or at least 2 different times there, wells were contested, and That's Genesis 26. Yeah, I was making sure I got the right reference there. But at least 2 different times those wells were contested, and Isaac surrendered the well to him. You think about how critical that is, and especially getting an idea of what you're talking about, and they all have flocks. The herdmen are who's contending over these things. That shows some humility on Isaac's part, that he actually, some people might say, I'm going to fight you to the death for this well, because I just busted it digging that well. That was not easy, and I'm not just handing it over to you. But they move on and they dig another one, and they take that. They say, all right, we'll move on somewhere else. So I think that gives you a little insight as to Isaac's character there. And his faith in God, that God was going to provide for him. So all this just with water. I mean, you think about how often we take water for granted. I mean, you go to the faucet, you turn it on, you expect there to be water. Go take a shower, you turn on the shower. It's just there. 100 gallons a day on average. That's a lot of water. I imagine if you could go back and have a conversation with somebody in that time and say, oh, we use about 100 gallons a day per person, they would just be floored. Because can you imagine going that often? By the way, you may have noticed in some of these references, who's typically drawing the water? The women. I don't think I'd want to mess with most of their women, because, I mean, they're hauling water. Water's not light. I mean, they're just, we didn't read that verse, but it's in Exodus where Moses, he flees from Egypt because he had killed the Egyptian and it was known, and he ends up seeing Jethro's daughter, right? And the herdmen are kind of picking on those ladies, and they're running them off. We're going to water our flocks first, and then we'll let you get your water. And, it was Moses who comes, and maybe that was kind of how he endeared himself to his future wife. He comes and runs those fellas off, and he stands up for the ladies there. So anyway, water's very, you got to have it for life. It's one of those things that sets Earth apart from every other planet. There's water. That's why we can't just pack up and go to another planet and set up settlements there. You got to have water. Water sets apart. And in the desert, it's not always easy to come by, but very interesting comparison in Scripture. Living water as opposed to water that you work for. The living water is coming to you, and it's a picture of God's grace and Jesus Christ coming down from heaven. He is the living water. So I thought that was really, really neat. I don't think I had ever made that connection before I went and visited the place in LaGrange and heard them talk about that. But when you understand that, to me, that makes John 4 so much more powerful when Jesus talks about He's the living water. And if you drink the living water, you never thirst again. It's not talking about physically, talking about spiritually. Were you going to say something, Brother Roger? Oh, I thought you were going to say something. I'm sorry. You going to? I was going to yield the floor to you, brother. Hey, thank y'all very much. Next week, Lord willing, we'll be in our gospel meeting next week. 2 weeks from tonight, Lord willing, we'll begin kind of looking at the life of a shepherd. A lot of this centers around water, so that kind of sets the stage. We'll talk about some of their